Yesterday's White House press briefing well, first of all, it was managed not by Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders, but by her deputy, the Deputy Press Secretary Raj Shah. And it got off to a very, very fast start because after the endless lies and the lies about firings and hirings and the lies about so much, Associated Press reporter Zeke Miller straight up said to Raj Shah as soon as he turned it over for questions after a couple-minute comment, "Why should we believe anything that you tell us at this point?" Which is really a pretty obvious question at this point, seen as very controversial and aggressive, but it's just sort of an obvious question. Let's watch. And what I'm most interested in is the just laughable response from Raj Shah here.
Zeke.
Thanks, Raj, and thanks for doing this. First, on Thursday, White House officials were up on this stage, and they said the president would sign the omnibus legislation. On Friday morning, he threatened to veto it, ultimately signed it. 10 days ago, Sarah said that H.R. McMaster had the president's confidence and support and wouldn't be leaving. Last Thursday, it was announced that he would be leaving the White House, and about 2.5 weeks ago, the president expressed confidence in his attorneys. And then there was a bit of a shakeup there last week. So could you speak to the White House's credibility? Why should we in this room, and more importantly, the American people, trust anything that this administration is telling them?
Well, our job as a press office and as an administration is to give you the best information that we have available to us, the most accurate information in a timely fashion. Sometimes the dynamics are fluid in any given situation. You mentioned some personnel matters. Facts and circumstances changed. We continue to give you guys the best information that we can as quickly as possible.
So good for Zeke Miller, right? This is a good question. This is the type of question that should be asked. But the next step, if you've got to press them, right? Raj Shah's answer is bogus unless the White House press team is genuinely kept in the dark about what is going on, which is possible. In the Trump administration, anything is possible, but it's sort of hard to believe. To say that they give the most accurate information they have at the time is obviously not believable. The White House press office hasn't been in this level of disarray and disrepair, I would argue, ever. And it goes back to the first day of this administration and Sean Spicer, who has done more to embarrass and discredit the office of the press secretary than any previous press secretary. And it started with his day one pronouncement. I call it the belligerent pronouncement, the coerced pronouncement we now know by Donald Trump, that Donald Trump had the biggest inauguration in the history of the United States, period, end of story. Spicer started his tenure as White House press secretary lying about the weather on Inauguration Day, something that hundreds of thousands of people personally experienced and millions more watched on television. And I also want to point out that not just the lying, but the admitting to lying isn't that rare in the administration. We know that they lie. Donald Trump recently admitted, as I covered, that he lied to foreign leaders, including specifically Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We covered it when it happened. Trump just making up assertions out of thin air about trade with Canada, just made it up. Hope Hicks, Trump's former, I guess like her sixth or seventh, who knows, White House communications director, she testified a few weeks ago that sometimes she would lie to the press for President Donald Trump. Kellyanne Conway concocting the Bowling Green massacre to justify who knows what depraved policy of Donald Trump's that he was pushing at the time, some kind of wall or ban or travel ban or whatever it was. This is what they do, right? So the answer to Zeke Miller's question here is there is no reason why anybody should trust any of these people. They should not be trusted. And even Trump came up once with the bogus lie, just a demonstrable factual lie, that he had the biggest electoral victory in history. He was straight up called out by a reporter in person. And just listen, Trump expressed no remorse. He said, well, that's what somebody told me.
I guess it was the biggest electoral college win since Ronald Reagan.
You said today that you had the biggest electoral margin since Ronald Reagan with 304 or 306 electoral votes. In fact, President Obama got 365. And
well, I'm talking about Republican.
President Obama 332 and George H.W. Bush 426 when he won as president. So why should Americans trust?
Well, no, I was given that information. I don't know. I was just given. We had a very, very big margin.
I guess my question is, why should Americans trust you when you accuse the information they receive of being fake when you're providing information that's...
Well, I don't know. I was given that information. I've seen that information around.
Yeah, I was thinking that a lot of people aren't familiar with that one, but it's bad. There is only one way in which what Raj said is true. Shah said that the press office provides the most accurate information at the time. It's possible they have no clue what's going on, right? The press office may genuinely have no reason to think that H.R. McMaster and Rex Tillerson are about to be fired, even almost as they are being fired, because they're not being told that it's going on. And that's the one other interpretation of this. And I don't know whether that's true. That would signal a whole host of other problems going on within the White House. Maybe it's something that we will someday learn about. But hey, I wish there were more follow-up, but good for Zeke Miller for asking the question. We can only hope there's more of this coming from the press corps. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. Show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Quick break, back after this. Normally, White House press secretaries know how to lie in ways that are plausibly deniable or open to interpretation. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders is now just concocting lies whole cloth out of thin air. You might remember that yesterday we talked about the census, the 2020 census, and I told you that Wilbur Ross, Secretary of Commerce, and his Commerce Department announced that they are going to bring back questions about citizenship in the 2020 census. And I explained to you yesterday, this is going to hold down the response rates of minorities. They will be undercounted. This will have the net result of shifting money away from some of the large blue states with high immigrant populations like California and New York State. It's going to play directly into the hands of Republican gerrymandering. And I also told you that citizenship questions have not been on the census since 1950. Sarah Huckabee Sanders was asked yesterday about this, and she came up with the really specific lie, a totally demonstrable falsehood, that the citizenship question has been on every census since 1965, other than 2010. What? How did she come up with that? We have absolutely no idea. Here's the video.
I want to talk a little bit about the census decision here. A lot of critics have concerns that including the citizenship question will discourage immigrants from participating. Can you talk us through how the government is going to address those concerns?
Look, this is a question that's been included in every census since 1965, with the exception of 2010 when it was removed. We've contained this question that's provided data that's necessary for the Department of Justice to protect voters and specifically to help us better comply with the Voting Rights Act, which is something that is important and a part of this process. And again, this is something that has been part of the census for decades and something that the Department of Commerce felt strongly needed to be included again.
What is the point of these briefings when it's just lies and no real answers to the questions, right? This is transparently, patently, absurdly false. And now that's the big lie, right? The big lie is, no, this has not been on every census since 1965 other than 2010. This has not been in the census at all since 1950. That was the big lie. There's also a smaller lie. Even though that was only like a 30-second answer, she actually told two major lies in that one answer. She also said something about the reason we put that back in is that the Commerce Department wanted to protect voters and comply with the Voting Rights Act. That's also made up out of thin air. This is all based on a letter from the DOJ, headed by Jeff Sessions, remember, asking that the census add the citizenship question back in on the basis of a recommendation from John Gore. John Gore was appointed by Donald Trump and is best known for Republican gerrymandering around the country. And that's the point of this question being added to the census. Earlier this week, the first question to the deputy press secretary was, why should we believe anything that you tell us? And I think that the first question at every subsequent press briefing should be, Sarah, at the last press briefing, you told us X, Y, and Z, all of which were lies. Will you be telling lies today? And are you willing to clarify those three lies from the last press briefing? That is how every single one of these press briefings should be handled. And I hope that today someone says to her, Sarah, yesterday you said that the citizenship question has been on every census since 65 other than 2010. That wasn't true. Can you tell us where you got that information? I hope that they will ask her that today.
Yeah, we'll see about that. There's also some low-hanging fruit here, which is that there was no census in 1965. The census occurs every 10 years in the years ending in a zero, so like 2000, 2010, 2020.
And that
Maybe
applies,
she's talking about another survey, but it wasn't the census.
And we're sure that there wasn't, for some reason, a census
Yeah,
in 1965.
I looked into it.
Yeah.
Every year since 1790, every 10th year.
Every 10 years, yeah. Listen, that is like a tertiary lie at this point, where it's barely even registering. And I don't know if the unhinged degree to which she's still telling these demonstrable lies is because she sort of gets a kick out of it. I've said it sort of looks like she really likes bullying the press corps and just, I apologize for what might seem as an unsavory comment, but sort of like throwing her weight around, not literally, but figuratively. Or does she feel like she's being bullied into telling these lies by Trump or by someone else? I don't know, but I'm starting to get emails from people who say they feel bad for Sarah Huckabee Sanders. I don't feel bad at all. She deserves to have her political career destroyed for agreeing to participate in this. No one forced her to take this job. Hopefully Sean Spicer's career is over, remains to be seen. He may just be on a sort of political break until he does his next thing. But I understand how we might all feel like some of these people are victims of Donald Trump, but she's one of the perpetrators. She may not be the top perpetrator, the perpetrator in chief, but she is a perpetrator here, and I don't feel bad for her whatsoever.
I think she could be on her way out, too. I remember in the last days of Sean Spicer, we saw less and less of him and more of Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
Yeah.
Now it looks like we're seeing more of Raj Shah, the new guy, perhaps.
Who I also think is an absolute disaster and would bring a whole new series of comedic press briefings. But yeah, I think that she is... Trump has had at least two instances, major instances over the last month where he's not been at all happy with Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And we'll see how long her tenure is as White House press secretary. Just making stuff up out of thin air. Discuss this with us on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Next, medical professor Donald Light will join me to talk about pharmaceutical industry myths. Looking forward to that. So Reuters is reporting some potentially pretty major news. We learned that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un went to China Sunday, was there until today, earlier today, they're 12, 13 hours ahead of us, on a non-official visit. And a picture of the two leaders, the Chinese President Xi and Kim Jong-un from North Korea, has been tweeted by a Chinese news agency, Xinhua News. And this was reported originally all by Chinese news and has since been confirmed. And as far as is known, this is the first time that Kim Jong-un has left North Korea since he took over power about 7 years ago in 2011. And according to China, while in China, President Xi and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un have negotiated a pledge from North Korea to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. And you will soon see why that language, denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, not just denuclearize North Korea, is very, very relevant language for what may be in Kim Jong-un's mind here that goes well beyond just being semantics. And this reportedly took place during a meeting between the leaders of the two countries, and the immediate reaction was, this must all be BS. But case in point, Kim Jong-un has not left North Korea since taking power, so it's all unprecedented. The fact that it sounds hard to believe really shouldn't tell us too much, because we already know that the trip in and of itself is sort of historic, at least in the context of Kim Jong-un's reign in North Korea. And there's plenty of reason to be skeptical, right? There's plenty of reason to believe that Kim Jong-un is thinking of what we think of when we hear about denuclearizing in the region. But the fact that this might be a thing is more than enough reason to talk about it and take it seriously. The real caveat here, and I alluded to this a couple minutes ago, is that Kim Jong-un more than likely agreed to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in theory if all American troops leave South Korea, which just is not likely to happen, right? This is potentially setting up the United States to be blamed by Kim Jong-un for impeding denuclearization, because Kim Jong-un now, by saying, hey, I'm open to denuclearizing the peninsula, which includes two countries, North and South Korea. What does that mean in terms of how we should interpret it? Well, the United States military, being the military of a nuclear nation, has a strong presence in South Korea. So what Kim Jong-un, I believe, is effectively saying here is, I'm willing to denuclearize North Korea if South Korea is willing to denuclearize, in the sense of getting all military from nuclear nations out of there, meaning United States troops have to go. And it just seems very difficult to think that that's going to happen. And in fact, it's very likely that this is an attempt, not a stupid one, by the way, by Kim Jong-un to take the high ground politically while he can, because there's this window here where it appears as though we are going in the direction of talks that will involve North and South Korea and the United States, potentially at the end of May of this year, just a couple of months from now. There's this window right now where Kim can take the political high ground and say, I'm ready to come to the table, which, by the way, he's always been willing to do. He's always been desperate to get to the same table as an American president. And I'm willing, conceptually, in theory, to agree to denuclearize the peninsula, which would more than likely require the United States to go. They meet, South Korea and the U.S. and North Korea says, hey, we want peace and stability. Let's have all nuclear powers leave the peninsula. We will denuclearize and U.S. troops must leave. Trump overreacts, says no, and then who knows what happens. And in the interim, of course, Donald Trump, completely predictably, on Twitter, pushing this as sort of a victory, something unique that he has been able to achieve, tweeting this morning, for years and through many administrations, everyone said that peace and the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was not even a small possibility. Now there is a good chance that Kim Jong-un will do what is right for his people and for humanity. Look forward to our meeting. And this is just, the narrative is so attractive to Trump. He's so obsessed with the idea as the sole and unique broker of progress in the region that he, if he even understands it, is ignoring it, but more than likely doesn't know nor care to understand that when Kim talks about the denuclearization of the peninsula, he's talking about Trump pulling troops. And he likes the narrative Trump does of, hey, I was elected. All of a sudden, Kim Jong-un might do what is right. It is more than likely that Kim Jong-un is at least on the path of playing Donald Trump here. And of course, Trump's just not knowledgeable enough to understand what it is that Kim Jong-un means by the denuclearization of the peninsula.
Yeah, presidents always take and receive credit for favorable world events, even if they had little to nothing to do with it.
Right.
But I think if there was an exchange where Trump is obnoxious, but North Korea decides to denuclearize, and it turns out the whole peninsula decides to denuclearize, that's good for us, I think, in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I guess. I don't know. It's just that would include Trump saying, yeah, we'll pull all of our troops more than likely, and that's just not going to happen. Last night, I decided to turn on the TV for a few minutes. I basically don't watch news shows or political shows. I've talked about this before. I've always got like some Netflix shows that I'm watching. And yesterday, I watched, what did I watch? I watched an episode of Hostages, great Israeli show. Finished watching an episode of that with my girlfriend. And I said, let's just see what's happening in the news, right? Like what's happening on Fox News, what's happening on MSNBC, what's happening on CNN. I turned to CNN, which by and large has been doing a mix of good reporting on the Trump administration combined with some salacious stuff that's less relevant. Certainly a much better option than Fox News for sure. And I see Anderson Cooper, who recently interviewed Stormy Daniels on 60 Minutes, sitting at his news desk with legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin, Michael Avenatti, who's the lawyer for adult film actress Stormy Daniels, as well as the lawyer for Trump's lawyer. So Trump has a lawyer, Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen is in such hot water now as a result of the Stormy Daniels thing and the non-disclosures that he has retained a lawyer named David Schwartz. As I've told you before, Trump's lawyer has not lawyered up here because of the trouble that that he believes Trump is in. He's lawyered up because he potentially is in trouble, tells us how bad things are going. This was one of the most embarrassing and pointless, nearly half-hour segments that I have ever seen on corporate media. Two lawyers yelling at each other the way they might do 30 seconds before turning to fisticuffs in a bar, right? Michael Cohen's lawyer, David Schwartz, is on the most fundamental level a complete and total embarrassment. His mere presence on the network is shameful. Stormy Daniels' attorney, Michael Avenatti, he's known as this really savvy legal operator. He completely embarrassed himself with his behavior, stooping to the same level as David Schwartz, making fun of Schwartz's weight at one point. How does it count as sort of legal exploration of the merits of a case to ridicule the fact that the other lawyer is heavy, right? I mean, it is absolute and total embarrassment. And I guess Anderson Cooper and Jeffrey Toobin did what they could to kind of control the situation, but CNN should certainly be embarrassed about this as well. I'm going to play only a few clips for you here. It's just some random stuff. It's all like this, nearly a half hour's worth. Take a look.
What's the first thing that you think of? I got to go to my Pilates class. That's the very first thing that I think of when someone comes up to me and threatens me with my daughter. Anyone who has a daughter knows you go right to the police. It's complete nonsense.
She said she didn't go to the police because she was scared, and she walked into the
Right,
the
that's
room.
why you go
and
to
her
the
hands were
police.
shaking. To the notion that he's saying that it's defamatory.
File a lawsuit. Look, the
Well,
majority
you
of
got
American...
the letter yesterday.
So wait a minute. Last time, you didn't let me talk. This time...
I'm letting you talk.
No, this time you are going to let me talk. Otherwise,
I let you
otherwise we're
talk.
going to have to get the defibrillator out for you, and I'm concerned about it. So let me
go
talk
for
here,
it. Go for it.
All right,
Yeah.
I almost brought it. I almost brought it today. I almost
okay.
brought the defibrillator.
Please, go for it.
All right,
Yeah.
look, the American people saw last night...
I think that's also kind of a fat joke, right? Like, is it because
Yes.
the guy's so heavy that if he keeps talking, he might need to be defibrillated? I don't even know. A half hour of this stuff. Here's just another random sampling from later on in the program.
She sat in an interview for 2 hours or thereabouts, and she faced the tough questions, and she answered them. And the American people saw those answers, saw how she answered the questions, and I think 90% of America... Let me finish.
90%?
Let me
Everyone's
finish.
scratching
Let
their
me
heads.
finish.
What was that interview?
Wait a minute, let me
Are you
finish.
saying that it was, are you saying that it was Michael Cohen who was in Las Vegas by the Pilates place? Are you saying it was him personally?
Of course it wasn't Michael
Okay,
Cohen.
I mean,
Well, you said that all along. You've been saying that.
I didn't think you'd
By
said
the way,
that.
you've been showing a CD.
You know what? There's a
and
reason
saying-
why.
One at a time,
There's a
one at a
reason.
time.
There's a
Let him
reason
finish.
why God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. You're
What about
supposed
your
to
fake
listen.
lie detector
You're supposed
test?
to listen.
What about
twice.
your phony
You're
lie
supposed to
detector
listen
test?
twice as much.
Where was the
You're
galvanic spit?
supposed to-
Persuasive legal arguments being made, right? These are two lawyers I would hire right away. And it's very easy to say it's one person instigating here. These are attorneys representing people who couldn't be more in the public eye, and they go on national media, and this is how they comport themselves on national television. Here's just another few seconds of this nonsense.
Can I just
Now,
jump-
to talk about the Mueller, to talk about some fantasy criminal indictment, you don't know what you're
Let me
talking
just-
about.
just-
It
Jeff,
just keeps coming out of your
Let
mouth.
me just-
You have no idea what you're talking about.
Interrupt this.
Look at you laughing. What do you,
Let me-
what do you speak to
I'm
Mueller?
laughing.
Can
Do
I-
you speak to
I'm
you
laughing.
know exactly what
I'm
they're
laughing.
doing?
Can I
I'm laughing.
just
you have no
raise
idea what you're talking about.
All
let
right,
me-
and just one more clip here, and this is sort of the epitome of the entire thing.
Let's talk about Michael Cohen, what kind of man this is. This is the kind of guy who claimed in connection with that story that there's no such thing as spousal rape. This is a legal genius.
Right.
Completely false. The guy doesn't even know the law. He's a thug.
Right.
Your friend is a thug.
Well, thank
Is
you.
a thug.
That's $1 million.
Thug. No, that's
$1
$3
million.
million. Thug.
$1 million.
Thug.
You know what?
Thug.
You're a thug.
Thug.
Anyone who would
Thug.
come on
Thug.
here.
Wait a second.
Anyone, you see, anyone.
Thug.
By the way,
He's a thug.
By
And
the
if
way,
he was
you
here, I'd tell him
doctored.
to him
You
his
doctored
face.
your lie detector test.
that's so-
Okay, no galvanic skin response.
This is an utter embarrassment. As far as the substance, the only substance came from really specific questions from CNN legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin, and it exposed that Cohen's attorney really doesn't have good answers to a whole host of questions. But it doesn't matter because the entire thing was just an embarrassment. Who at CNN thinks this is a good idea? How is it responsible counsel? And forget about Schwartz, right? Schwartz is there merely to muddle the water. That's all he wants to do because Michael Cohen is not in a good position. But Stormy Daniels and her attorney presumably are there to make her seem more credible, to explain the legal underpinnings of what's going on here. What is the upside for Avenatti to appear in a setting like this and to be completely unable to control himself? It is pathetic and embarrassing every step of the way. And this is where I go off to the point where I say Is this just all we can expect from a network like this? Because they've done some good stuff.
Yeah, should Anderson Cooper have done a better job at facilitating that debate,
don't
or
know.
did he just let it go because it's good television after all?
Is it though? I mean, the thing is, I don't know that it is actually good, because when you've got four people talking at once, it almost doesn't matter who it is or what they're saying. It just doesn't work. And I get to my bottom line on the story, which is I think that this is a legitimate story, not because Trump had sex with someone, but because the payoff might have been illegal, because of the concerning pattern of lies and manipulation of women, all of that stuff. But we're not dealing with any of the real substance when it's four people talking over each other for a half hour and acting literally like school children. One of the worst moments I've seen on CNN in a very, very long time. This is one of the more complicated stories where there are lots of little details and it can become kind of difficult to keep it straight, but I want to try because it's a really important story. And the wide angle on this is that we've now learned that the hacker Guccifer 2.0 was a Russian intelligence officer. Now, why do we care about Guccifer 2.0? The reason we care is that Guccifer 2.0 was considered to be the person or maybe a group of people that hack the DNC. That's the hack that led to the infamous leaks that were at the center of endless election controversy, that it seemed as though the Trump campaign had foreknowledge of when they were going to be released as well. So without getting into the really technical stuff that's not really of interest to our audience and not really relevant to most of our audience, what happened is that Guccifer slipped up. Guccifer at 2.0 was portraying themselves as Romanian. That was sort of suspect all along because of the really terrible Romanian that Guccifer 2.0 appeared to speak. And long story short, U.S. investigators have identified Guccifer 2.0 not generally as a Russian intelligence officer, but as a specific GRU officer working out of the GRU headquarters in a particular office in Moscow, Russia. And this happened because normally Guccifer 2.0 would use a VPN, that's a virtual private network, and that hides their actual location. One time, at least one time that we know about, Guccifer did not activate that VPN and left an actual real Moscow IP address in the server logs of an American social media company. Guccifer 2.0, we know, was directly in touch with Trump advisor Roger Stone via Twitter. Stone has admitted this. But the big news here is that this makes it even more difficult for Donald Trump to deny collusion and coordination. It makes it even more difficult to believe that Trump and his associates were not directly involved with someone who we now know to be a Russian intelligence officer. Because for a long time, you had Trump and his administration denying what was the intelligence community consensus, that Russia was behind the DNC hacks. We also know from the public timing of a number of different social media posts and meetings and public statements that there seemed to be some pretty significant awareness, even maybe ahead of time, of when these leaks were going to take place. If the hackers who got those documents are Russian intelligence officers, that is yet another link between Donald Trump and his team's knowledge of these hacks and the Russian individual who did the hacking. But even putting Trump aside for a second here, Roger Stone admitted that he was in touch with someone who we now know to have been a Russian intelligence officer, Guccifer 2.0, who did the hacking. That's sort of like a case closed, end of story. And I can only imagine that this isn't going to go unnoticed by Robert Mueller. And by the way, we've also learned that Robert Mueller has now taken over the investigation of Guccifer 2.0, which puts yet another layer onto this. Mueller can now prove that Roger Stone, who was one of Trump's closest advisors, was in touch not just generally with the vague and amorphous Russians. Stone was in touch with a specific, nameable intelligence operative in Russia. I just hope that before we find out more about this, we don't hear that this intelligence officer has accidentally fallen on a knife 10 times and then subsequently thrown himself out of a window. These accidents happen all the time in Russia. accidentally ingesting polonium happens all the time to people that could be a liability to the Russian state. I really hope that that doesn't happen here, because this is actually a major story.
Yeah, sometimes people will shoot themselves in the head 4 or 5 times, which I didn't even know you could do.
I didn't know that
happens in
either. Yeah,
Russia.
or in the back multiple times. It's crazy what people are able to do in Russia when they just coincidentally happen to be in a situation that is dangerous when it comes to the Kremlin's perspective. This also, by the way, starts to paint a more accurate picture of why Sam Nunberg seemed just horrified about the possibility of turning over his communications with Roger Stone to Robert Mueller. How many weeks ago was it that the Nunberg, it was like 2-3 weeks ago. Yeah. Sam Nunberg went on all sorts of media and started saying he's ignoring a subpoena from Robert Mueller, that he's not going to turn over his communications with Roger Stone. And he seemed a combination of both under the influence of alcohol, which Erin Burnett pointed out during her CNN interview, and just genuinely afraid. And now that we know that Stone was not only in touch generally with Russians, but with Guccifer 2.0, who we now know to be a Russian intelligence officer, I actually get why Nunberg was so afraid, right? If I was Nunberg and I knew what Stone was doing, and maybe speculated or had an inkling that Guccifer was a Russian intelligence operative, and Mueller says, give me all your communications that you've had with Roger Stone, I'd probably look as afraid as Nunberg myself and would be drinking before national TV interviews.
Oh, sure. And Sam Nunberg said that he didn't want to betray Roger Stone because he was his longtime mentor.
Right.
I mean, you got to have a better reason than that. You're going to flip pretty quickly, I think, if you're up against Robert Mueller.
I think that we have seen those who we would have presumed loyalty to the Trump apparatus from flip already. And it never rang true from the beginning, and now we're learning more about why. So it's going to be an interesting several weeks, that's for sure. Let's take a break, discuss this and any other stories from today's show on the David Pakman Show subreddit, which you can subscribe to instantly at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. The Daily Beast has just a blockbuster article out, which, if it's accurate, confirms what would be really the first publicly known connection between Trump staffers and associates, and not just Russians, but Russian intelligence operatives, known colloquially sometimes as Russian spies. And we're talking here about Rick Gates. Rick Gates is the business partner of former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, both of whom have been indicted by Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. And what the Daily Beast has learned and is reporting is that the prosecutors working for Robert Mueller have now been able to directly link Gates to a person tied to Russian intelligence. Obvious question we should all have when the Daily Beast reports this: how do we learn? How did they learn this? And the way that they learned this is because of court filings that were released a couple of days ago, which say that Gates and an unnamed person who worked for one of Paul Manafort's companies were in touch in the months leading up to the November of 2016 election. I think they specifically know even September and October, August, September, October, somewhere in that range. And they've described the connections between Gates and this individual linked to Russian intelligence as, quote, pertinent to the investigation, meaning Robert Mueller's investigation into Trump-Russia coordination, collusion, and possible criminality. The court filing, the same court filing that's the basis of this Daily Beast report, also says, and this is the key part, right, that Gates knew that this individual was connected to Russian intelligence. And if true, absolutely huge, because this is crossing the line into knowing and deliberate contact specifically for the purposes of the Donald Trump campaign with individuals in the Russian government. In this case, it's even more specific in the sense that it's Russian intelligence operatives. Now, there are people who will hear me say this, and I'll get calls from them, emails, live calls, who knows. Maybe tomorrow we'll hear from some of them who will say, David, there is simply no evidence that a crime took place, no matter what coordination there was, no matter what, quote, collusion there was. But that now is also a narrative that we have to refute, because the list of possible crimes here continues to get longer and longer the more we learn about what took place. So accepting assistance and things of value, be they money or information, as we've talked about, from foreign entities for a federal election in the United States is a crime, right? That's one possible crime that is on the list here. Covering up those incidents of receiving things of value, also a crime. Obstructing investigations into those incidents regarding the receipt of things of value from foreign entities for elections is also a crime. Lying to investigators about those incidents is a crime. And when multiple people work together to either cover up or obstruct or mislead, that can also be the crime of conspiracy. And the talking point from the Russia denialists, and there's some on the right and there's some on the left, as you probably well know at this point, is, David, collusion's not a crime. Collusion simply is not something that is a crime in the criminal code. That's sort of like saying killing people with guns isn't a crime. I can find no crime called or described as killing people with guns. Well, just because it's not in the criminal code that way doesn't mean it isn't this thing called murder, right? And that starts to become really a semantic disagreement. Colluding where the foreign entity provides things of material value is a crime. It wouldn't be called collusion, but we're speaking colloquially here about the various crimes that might be included under that umbrella. Now, also stunning is that this story barely registered yesterday in the midst of news about Trump bragging about what's going on with North Korea, Stormy Daniels, Trump missing from the public eye with absolutely nothing scheduled up until today for long periods of time, Facebook story. And even if this story did get more coverage, the committed Trumpists aren't going to care, right? They'll talk about what's going on with Donald Trump and unemployment or whatever, the same unemployment numbers that they didn't believe under President Obama. And in fact, I saw the other day on CNN, the day that CNN re-aired Anderson Cooper's 60 Minutes interview with Stormy Daniels, CNN sat down with a bunch of Trump voting women. I don't remember where it was. I think it was somewhere in the South. And it was just total cognitive dissonance, right? Some of them saying this was a long time ago. Others saying we simply don't believe it. Others saying Trump's personal life all of a sudden just isn't a concern for us because his legislative positions are Christian and close to God. So if you're waiting around, as I know there are some people waiting around, they email me, they say, David, as soon as X happens, then the Trumpists will fully abandon Trump. No, they won't. The Trumpists are ideologically and fully committed to Donald Trump. And the extent to which cognitive dissonance is going to keep them there goes well beyond another dozen accusers of sexual assault against Donald Trump, or even more connections here with Russia. So we've got to just forget about them, and we've got to do whatever we can to make sure that justice is carried out here, because they're not going to come over to the side of logic and reason. Things have not been going well for right-wing news website Breitbart of Trump advisor Steve Bannon fame. Their ad revenue has been falling off a cliff. More and more companies have been pulling ad from the website. There's been a really great social media shame campaign to get advertisers to pull money from Breitbart. And there's now a new allegation against Breitbart, and it relates to the failed candidacy of serial accused child sex assaulter Roy Moore in Alabama's special election. A lawyer representing one of Moore's accusers has come forward and said that some of Roy Moore's supporters offered him money to drop the accuser as a client. Now, how does it involve Breitbart? Part of the offer was that the lawyer would make a specific statement about dropping the accuser as a client, which would be released only and directly to Breitbart News. He would also be paid $10,000 and get the pleasure, I guess, of being introduced directly to Stephen Bannon. So this has immediately raised questions about why did he have to go to Breitbart with a statement as part of the agreement? Why would anyone even think to include that? Was anyone involved in trying to pay off the attorney to drop his client working with or connected to Breitbart in the first place? And the bigger question is the allegation credible? And I don't really have trouble believing that Breitbart and Moore supporters would try to hurt the accusers by getting rid of their legal representation. The only part that strikes me as less believable is that they think they could buy the lawyer with just $10,000, right? You would imagine that professional bribers know you've got to offer more than 10 grand to a lawyer to get them to drop such a notable client who's in the public eye. And for what it's worth, the people named in the article as being involved in reaching out to the lawyer haven't denied doing this. They've simply said, we did not do anything wrong or illegal, which is basically like saying, yeah, we did it and it was perfectly fine to do. And the projection here is just stunning, because you'll remember that when the Washington Post first broke some of the stories of these accusers of Roy Moore, you had people on the right who were saying the Washington Post paid the women to make up the stories. Now of course, there was no evidence of that. Now we learn that it actually might have been the right trying to pay off the lawyers representing the accusers so that they would drop the cases. And it is absolutely pathetic and disgusting if true. There's a very clear silver lining here, though, which is that Breitbart really seems to be in disarray and on its way down. That is a really great media story. It remains to be seen if they ultimately meet their total demise. But the latest allegations that they were directly involved in this, truly and absolutely disgusting. And we'll continue to follow what ultimately happens with Breitbart. Yesterday, I was checking out Donald Trump's Twitter account, as I often do, and there was plenty of sort of weird grammar and random capitalization, very, very childish language syntax. And in the midst of all that, I saw Trump tweeting pictures of a wall and some construction equipment saying, we're starting the Mexico wall construction. And I found it sort of weird because they're only now working on getting some of the initial money to start some border wall construction. So I thought, how could it be that they're already starting construction? Like it can take days just to even get the equipment to where it needs to be. So today I looked into it in more detail, and it turns out that Trump actually tweeted pictures of previously planned repairs to existing areas of border fencing that have actually been there since the 1990s. And Donald Trump's pictures are completely misleading fabrications, but I'm sure that they're playing really, really well with his base. Trump tweeted yesterday, great briefing this afternoon on the start of our southern border wall. And if you look at the pictures, a number of them there, you'll see pictures of what genuinely appears to be construction of some kind of wall or fence. But it turns out that this project Trump is tweeting about started almost 10 years ago. It has nothing to do with Trump whatsoever. And in fact, some of the exact same pictures that Trump included in his tweet were tweeted weeks ago by Border Patrol in a post about the replacement of a section of a couple of miles of fence that was already predetermined that it would take place. And what's more, there hasn't even been a decision made yet as to what the new wall will look like, as well as if and when construction will start, which it hasn't yet. It's another day and it's another lie. And the theme that we're seeing is the belligerence of the lies going up, right? Whole cloth concocted lies. Yesterday, Sarah Huckabee Sanders on the citizenship questions on the census issue, saying, other than 2010, we've had a question about citizenship on every census since 1965. Whole cloth fabrications. Trump just tweeting pictures of something that's completely unrelated to his Mexico border wall. And I think that this is a good opportunity to take this even further. The new conversation about the wall is how much money will be made available for it. Will the military pay for it, right? That's a new idea that Donald Trump has come up with. When will we be able to start construction on it? This is providing cover for the premise and promise that's been long forgotten that Mexico was going to pay for the wall, right? Donald Trump throughout the campaign said Mexico is going to pay for the wall. That I promise you. Who's even talking about that anymore? Nobody, because it was a lie from the beginning. It was never going to happen. And it's the last thing that right-wingers want to talk about. And if you force them to talk about it, they'll say, well, it's the fault of Democrats or Mexicans or whoever, that it's not going to happen. If it were up to Trump, it would. But that's the whole point. A lot of things that if they were up to the candidate would happen. If it were up to Bernie, we'd have Medicare for all. That doesn't mean that just promising it with no plan is something we should excuse, because if it were unilaterally up to them, it would happen. And I was thinking about this and I wondered, is it possible that someone, maybe to keep Trump from becoming irate, we know he gets a twice a day propaganda good news file. Is it possible someone came to Trump with these pictures and said, look, Mr. Trump, they're building the wall and Trump has been tricked into thinking that this is the wall? I don't know. I saw an interesting analogy on Reddit. A lot of us growing up, if you had Nintendo, your little brother or sister wanted to play. And maybe it wasn't a two-player game or you didn't want to be bothered. So you would hand them a controller that wasn't plugged into anything, and they would just be happy because they thought that they were playing. Is the equivalent being done with Trump, where he was given pictures of this border fence and he genuinely thinks they're doing the thing he wants?
I don't know. I think he was actively trying to deceive his base.
You do think so?
And that's because he has to fulfill that campaign promise. When it comes to some of the other ones, like the economy's going to soar, or we're going to win so much, you're going to be tired of winning. With that stuff, you can kind of like cherry pick information. When it comes to the wall, when in 2020 comes around, it's going to be, is there a wall constructed on the southern border or is there not?
Well, and it's very clear what they're going to say, which is they'll use stuff like what's happening, the replacement of fencing from 1990s that has been scheduled to be replaced for almost 10 years. They'll say that's an example of Trump achieving it if he's not able to achieve more. Lie after lie after lie.